The letter that changed Minnie Brooks's life arrived on a Tuesday in April of 1878, smelling of salt and tar. And by the time she stepped off the mail coach at Port Amity 3 weeks later, she had read it so many times the creases had begun to tear. She stood on the muddy boardwalk of the little Mendocino county town with her father's sea chest at her feet and a hand-copied appointment letter from the United States Lighthouse board clutched inside her coat, and she looked out past the rooftops toward the gray line of ocean beyond, searching for the tower she had been dreaming about since she was a girl of 6, sitting on her father's knee while he told her stories of the beam that never slept. Cape Solace Light. Her post now, granted by the board after old Tobias Reed had died of fever in his keeper's cottage the previous winter, and after the post had sat dark and unclaimed for 3 long months because no man wanted a station so remote, so battered by weather, so far from any town worth its salt. No man wanted it, but Minnie Brooks did. She was 24 years old, unmarried, with her father's steady hands and her mother's stubborn chin, and she had spent half her childhood on the rocks below a different lighthouse, on the coast of Maine, learning to trim a wick and polish brass, and read the moods of the sea the way other girls learned embroidery. Her father, Jonas Brooks, had kept that light for 22 years until a fall from the gallery one October night had ended him, and after that there had been nothing left for Minnie in the East but her mother's grief and a string of relatives who thought a woman alone was a burden to be married off as quickly as decency allowed. She had written to the Lighthouse board instead. She had waited. And now, standing in the mud of a rough coastal town with gulls screaming overhead and the smell of wood smoke and fish everywhere, she had her answer. "You'll be wanting a wagon out to Solace Point," said the man behind the mercantile counter, an older fellow with tobacco-stained whiskers when she asked directions. He looked her up and down with open skepticism. "You're not fixing to go out there alone, are you, miss?" "I am the new keeper," Minnie said, and set the appointment letter on the counter for him to see, though she suspected he could not read it any better than he could read her intentions. The man's eyebrows rose toward his hairline. "Keeper. A lady keeper. Well, I'll be." He scratched his jaw. "Ain't been a soul out at that light since old Tobias passed, except," he stopped himself, glanced toward the window and did not finish the thought. "Except what?" "Nothing, miss, just talk. Folks around here say the light's been seen burning some nights anyhow, even with nobody living out there. Ghost of old Tobias, some say, keeping his watch even in death." He gave an uneasy laugh. "Others say it's just moonlight playing tricks on the lens. I wouldn't put much stock in it." Minnie did not put much stock in ghosts, but she filed the story away all the same, because she had learned from her father that lighthouses collected strange tales the way their lanterns collected moths, and there was usually a plain truth buried somewhere beneath the fright. The wagon ride out to Solace Point took the better part of 3 hours, along a rutted track that hugged the cliffs above a churning, iron-colored sea, through stands of redwood so tall and so shadowed that Minnie felt she had entered another country entirely, one where the ordinary rules of towns and neighbors did not apply. The driver, a taciturn young man named Silas who worked odd jobs for the mercantile, said little beyond warning her twice about the road's washouts, and by the time the Cape itself came into view, jutting into the gray Pacific like a clenched fist of black rock, the sun was already sliding low and orange toward the water. The lighthouse stood at the tip of the point, a whitewashed tower some 60 feet tall, its paint peeling in long strips, its lantern room dark against the coming dusk. Beside it crouched the keeper's cottage, shutters hanging crooked, a garden gone entirely to weeds. It was, Minnie thought, a sorrowful sight, a post that had been loved once and then left to rot, and something in her chest tightened with a fierce, protective ache, the same feeling she used to get watching her father climb the tower stairs each evening of her childhood. "This is as far as I go," Silas said, hauling her trunk down from the wagon bed and setting it in the weeds. "Storm's coming in off the water tonight, miss. You sure you want to be out here alone?" "I am the keeper," Minnie said again, because it seemed the only answer that mattered, and watched him turn the wagon back toward the tree line and disappear. She was alone then, entirely alone, on a wind-scoured point of rock with the sea hissing below and the light going purple and then gray above her. And for one unsteady moment she let herself feel the size of what she had done, leaving behind everything and everyone she knew to claim a post that even hardened men had refused. Then she squared her shoulders, the way her father had taught her, and went to find the door. The cottage was worse inside than out. Mice had gotten into the flour, the stove was choked with rust, and a broken windowpane had let in enough rain to warp the floorboards near the hearth. But the tower, when she climbed its spiral stairs with a borrowed lantern held high, took her breath away in a different fashion entirely. The great lens sat in its iron cage exactly as it should, a masterwork of glass prisms that her father would have called a jewel fit for a queen, and though a skin of dust and salt film covered it, it was whole and undamaged. Someone had cared for it. Someone had cared for it recently. She ran a finger along the brass fittings and found no rust, no grit in the gears that turned the lamp mechanism. The reservoir that should have held lard oil or kerosene was near empty, but a fresh wick, trimmed neat as a soldier's collar, sat waiting in the burner. "Someone has been here," she murmured aloud, and the sound of her own voice in that glass-walled room startled her. She thought of the storekeeper's story then, of the light scene burning with no keeper to tend it, and a shiver walked up her spine that had nothing to do with the cold wind rattling the panes. Ghosts, the man had said. Minnie did not believe in ghosts. But she believed, standing there with the last light dying over the water and a storm rising black on the horizon, that someone very much alive had been keeping this vigil in her absence, and she meant to find out who. She did not have to wait long. That very night, as the wind rose to a scream and rain lashed the tower windows in great gray sheets, Minnie worked frantically by lantern light to fill the reservoir from what oil she had carried in her own trunk, her hands shaking with cold and haste, terrified that the light would go dark on her very first night, and some ship out there in the howling black would pay for her failure with its hull and its souls. She had just gotten the flame caught and the great lens beginning to turn when she heard boots on the tower stairs below, heavy and unhurried, climbing toward her. Minnie spun, snatching up the fire poker from beside the small stove that heated the lamp room, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Who's there?" The door to the lantern room opened, and there, filling the frame nearly shoulder to shoulder, stood the largest man Minnie had ever seen up close. He wore a coat of oiled buckskin dark with rain, and beneath it his shoulders strained the seams of a woolen shirt, muscle roped thick along his forearms where his sleeves were pushed back despite the cold. His hair was dark and too long for a town man's fashion, falling wet and heavy past his collar, and a close beard shadowed a jaw that looked as though it had been carved from the same granite as the cape itself. He was, Minnie thought with a jolt she did not have time to examine, exactly the sort of man her aunts back east would have called a savage, and exactly the sort of man who looked as though he could tear the lighthouse door from its hinges without much effort. "Put that down," he said, in a voice low and rough as gravel underfoot, nodding at the poker. "I mean you no harm. You'll forgive me if I don't take a stranger's word for that, climbing into my lighthouse in the middle of a storm." Minnie did not lower the poker. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, there and gone. "Your lighthouse. I am the appointed keeper of Cape Solace Light, sent by the United States Lighthouse Board, and you are trespassing on federal property." She said it as firmly as she could manage, though her voice shook on the last word, betraying her. The big man's dark eyes moved past her to the lamp, burning steady now behind its lens, and something in his broad shoulders eased, as though a weight had shifted off them. "Then you'd best keep that flame trimmed proper," he said. "There's a schooner working up the coast tonight, and if this light gutters, she'll run herself onto Solace Rock same as the Annalee did 2 winters back, and every soul aboard her will drown not 50 yards from shore." He looked at her then, really looked, taking in her sodden skirts and her white-knuckled grip on the poker and the fear she was trying so hard to swallow. Name's Emmett Warren. I've a cabin up the ridge yonder. Been keeping this light lit since Tobias passed, best I could manage, because there weren't nobody else fool enough to climb this tower in a blow, and I couldn't stomach the thought of ships wrecking on account of an empty post. Minnie lowered the poker an inch, though she did not set it down. You're the ghost, then? That earned her a real laugh, short and surprised, that transformed his stern face entirely for one unguarded moment. Reckon I am. Fooled half of Port Amity into thinking Tobias Reed still walks these stairs. He shrugged out of his sodden coat and hung it on a peg by the door as though he had done so 100 times before, which Minnie realized with a strange twist of feeling he probably had. You the new keeper truly, or are you lost, ma'am? Minnie Brooks, she said, and I am truly the keeper. My appointment came from Washington itself, signed by the district superintendent. I've kept lights before, Mr. Warren. My father was a keeper for 22 years, and I learned every part of the trade at his side before he passed. Emmett studied her for a long moment, rain still dripping from his hair onto the floor, and outside the wind threw itself against the glass with a fury that made the whole tower groan. 22 years is a long apprenticeship, he said finally. Suppose that's more than most men out here have got. He moved past her to check the lamp mechanism with the easy familiarity of long practice, testing the clockwork that turned the lens, adjusting a screw here, a valve there. Oil's low. You'll not have enough to see through till dawn, not with a storm like this eating the wick twice as fast. I have more in my trunk below. Not enough, if what I saw when I passed your wagon tracks is the whole of your provisions. He turned to face her fully then, and in the lamplight she could see the weathering of his face, the lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years spent outdoors in wind and sun, and beneath the wildness of him something steady, something that did not waver even as the tower shook around them. I've oil at my cabin, enough to see you through the week while you send to town for a proper resupply. I'll fetch it if you'll allow me. Minnie hesitated. Every lesson her mother had ever drilled into her about the dangers of strange men on lonely roads rose up at once, and yet there was something in Emmett Warren's manner, some plain, unadorned honesty, that made her trust him more than she had trusted the storekeeper back in town. Perhaps it was simply that he had kept this light burning for 3 months with no one to thank him and no wage to earn for it, asking nothing in return, but that ships not wreck upon the rocks below his mountain. I would be grateful, she said at last, for the oil, Mr. Warren, not for anything else. Didn't offer anything else, he said, and there was that ghost of a smile again, and then he was gone, down the tower stairs and out into the storm, leaving Minnie alone with the burning lamp and a great deal to think about. He was back before the hour was out, soaked through again, hauling 2 heavy cans of lamp oil up the tower stairs as though they weighed nothing at all, and Minnie could not help but notice the way his muscles bunched and strained beneath his wet shirt with the effort, the sheer size and strength of him that seemed at odds with the careful, gentle way he set the cans down beside the reservoir so as not to spill a drop. That'll see you through the week, he said, straightening. After that you'll want to send word to the district office for your regular allotment. Tobias used to have it shipped in by schooner every quarter, though half the time the schooner captains didn't fancy putting in close to Solace Rocks, and the delivery would run late. Thank you, Minnie said, and meant it with her whole heart. I don't know how I would have managed tonight without you. Emmett shrugged, a gesture that seemed to cost him some effort as though he was unused to being thanked for anything. Wasn't for you, he said. Was for the ships, same as it's always been. But his dark eyes lingered on her a moment longer than the words strictly required, and Minnie felt a warmth rise in her cheeks that she told herself was only the heat of the lamp room. He left soon after, vanishing into the storm with the same silent ease with which he had appeared, and Minnie spent the rest of that first night alone in the tower, watching the great lens turn its patient beam out over the black water, thinking of gray eyes and broad shoulders, and a kindness so plainly worn it seemed the man himself did not know how deep it ran. The days that followed fell into a kind of rhythm that Minnie found, to her own surprise, deeply satisfying. She scrubbed the cottage from floor to rafters, mended the broken window pane with glass she found stored in the tool shed, coaxed the rusted stove back to life with lamp oil and patience, and spent her mornings clearing the garden of weeds so that she might plant vegetables before the summer set in too hard. In the afternoons, she climbed the tower to polish the great lens until it threw rainbows across the walls, checked the clockwork mechanism that turned it, trimmed wicks, and made careful notes in the station log exactly as her father had taught her, recording weather and ship sightings and the state of her supplies in a neat, steady hand. Emmett Warren came by more often than strict necessity required, though he always found some plain reason for it. He brought a haunch of venison from a deer he had taken in the hills, saying only that a woman living alone ought not go hungry while she got her garden started. He brought seasoned firewood, split and stacked with the precision of a man who took quiet pride in doing a task well. He mended the cottage roof where a storm had loosened shingles, climbing up with a hammer and nails without being asked, working shirtless in the June sun until Minnie, bringing him water, had to remind herself firmly to keep her eyes on his face and not on the broad, muscled expanse of his back and shoulders, slick with sweat, moving beneath skin brown dark by years outdoors. "You needn't do all this, Mr. Warren," she told him one such afternoon, standing at the base of the ladder with a dipper of well water in her hand. "I am quite capable of managing on my own. My father raised me to it." Emmett came down the ladder, took the offered dipper, and drank deeply before answering, his throat working, a bead of water tracing down into the dark hair at the base of his neck. "Don't doubt your capability, Miss Brooks," he said. "Watched you polish that lens brighter than Tobias ever managed in the 10 years I knew him. But a roof's a two-man job when the shingles have gone to rot like these had, and I had the time to spare." "You always seem to have the time to spare," Minnie observed, not without a small smile. Something flickered across his face then, quick as a cloud shadow crossing the water, and he looked away toward the tower, its white paint gleaming fresh where she had begun to touch it up with a brush and a bucket of lime wash. "Man alone in the mountains has plenty of time," he said, and something in his voice had gone quieter, more guarded, and Minnie sensed she had brushed up against something tender in him, some old wound not yet healed, and did not press further, though her curiosity burned. It was another 2 weeks before he told her about Sarah and Grace, and even then it came out sideways, unplanned, on an evening when a soft rain was falling, and Minnie had invited him to share a supper of venison stew as thanks for all his help. And they sat at the small table in her cottage kitchen, with a single lamp burning between them, the light catching the silver that had begun to thread through his dark hair at the temples, though he could not have been more than 32 or 33 years of age. "You never say much about yourself, Mr. Warren," Minnie said, ladling more stew into his bowl though he had not asked for it. "A man doesn't come to live alone on a mountain above a lighthouse without some manner of story behind him." Emmett was quiet for a long moment, turning his spoon over in his big, scarred hands, hands that Minnie had come to notice were always careful with delicate things, gentle with the lens, gentle with the seedlings she had asked him to help her plant, gentle in a way that seemed almost a contradiction to their size and strength. "Had a wife once," he said finally, not looking up. "Sarah. And a daughter, Grace, would have been near 7 years old now." He paused, and the rain ticked softly against the window glass. "Scarlet fever took them both inside of a week, back in the winter of '74. We were living outside Sacramento then. I was working timber for a lumber outfit. Wasn't a doctor for 30 miles, and by the time I got one, there weren't nothing to be done." His jaw tightened, the muscle there jumping visibly beneath his beard. "Came out to this coast after because I couldn't stand to look at that house no more, couldn't stand the quiet of it with them gone. Found the mountain above Solace Point, built myself a cabin and been here ever since. Trap some, hunt some, sell hides and meat in Port Amity when I need coin for supplies. Don't need much else." "I'm so very sorry," Minnie said softly, and reached across the small table to lay her hand over his, an instinctive gesture of comfort that she only realized might be forward after she had already done it. But Emmett did not pull away. He turned his hand beneath hers, palm up, so that her smaller hand rested inside his broad one, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the rain falling steady outside and the lamp flame trembling gently between them. Tobias's light going dark, and knowing what would happen to ships that ran this coast blind, Emmett said at last. It felt like something I could do, something that mattered. Couldn't save my own family, but I could keep strangers off the rocks. Seemed a fair enough trade with whatever's up there keeping score. He glanced up at her then, and his dark eyes were unguarded in a way Minnie had not seen before. Then you came, with your father's training and your stubborn chin, and I thought maybe I could stop climbing that tower every night like a man serving a penance and just be a neighbor instead. Didn't expect I'd want to keep climbing it anyhow, just for the company at the top. Minnie felt her heart turn over entirely at that, and she did not trust herself to speak for a moment, only tightened her fingers gently around his. My father died falling from a lighthouse gallery, she said finally, matching confession for confession. I was 22. My mother wanted me to marry a shipping clerk in Portland and forget the sea altogether. I couldn't do it, Mr. Warren. I couldn't let the only life I'd ever known and loved die with him. When the board's letter came granting me this post, I wept for an hour from grief and joy both at once, because I knew I was finally going to have my father's life back, even if I had to build it myself out of an abandoned station nobody else wanted. Nobody else wanted it, Emmett echoed, on account of it being remote and hard and lonely. You don't strike me as a woman afraid of hard or lonely. No, Minnie agreed, though I confess it has been considerably less lonely these past weeks than I expected it to be. The look that passed between them then said far more than either of them was yet ready to put into words, and it was Emmett who broke it first, clearing his throat and withdrawing his hand with obvious reluctance to reach for his coat. Storm's easing, he said. I ought to get back up the mountain before dark proper sets in. At the door he paused, looking back at her with the lamp light catching the strong planes of his face. I'll come by tomorrow if that suits. Garden could use another hand with the fence. Keep the deer from your cabbages. That suits very well, Mr. Warren, Minnie said, and watched him vanish into the wet evening, her hand still warm from where his had held it. The first true test of Minnie's keepership came in the second month of her tenure, in the shape of a storm the like of which even Emmett said he had not seen in years, born somewhere far out in the Pacific and driven landward by a wind that screamed like a living thing across the Cape. It began in the late afternoon with a sky gone the color of an old bruise, greenish-black and roiling, and by the time full dark fell the rain was coming in horizontal sheets that turned the tower windows into sheets of running silver, and the sea below had risen into great combers that broke white and furious against Solace rocks with a sound like cannon fire. Minnie had climbed the tower an hour before sunset to light the lamp, as was proper, and had just gotten the mechanism turning steady when Emmett arrived, soaked through, his long hair plastered to his skull, having fought his way down the mountain track through wind that had already toppled 2 good-sized firs across the path. There's a schooner working this coast tonight, he shouted over the wind, barely audible even inside the glass-walled lamp room. Saw her running lights from the ridge before the rain closed in thick. She's too close to shore, fighting to make sea room, and if this wind don't ease she'll be driven onto the rocks sure as sunrise. Minnie's stomach dropped, but she did not let fear slow her hands. The lamp is burning steady. That's all I can do, keep it burning and trust her captain to see it and steer clear. Reservoir's near half empty already, and this storm will burn twice the oil of an ordinary night, Emmett said, already moving to check the level, his big hands sure and quick despite the tower's violent swaying in the wind. You've the resupply coming, but it's not due for another 5 days. Then we ration what we have and refill as often as needed, Minnie said, already reaching for the spare cans stored beneath the workbench, cans that Emmett himself had helped her stock in the weeks since her arrival. I will not let this light fail while there is a single drop of oil left on this point, Mr. Warren." They worked together through that long and terrible night, trading watches at the lamp, refilling the reservoir every few hours as the wind devoured the oil far faster than any ordinary evening, climbing down periodically to check the cottage had not flooded, to make certain the woodpile Emmett had stacked against the shed wall had not blown away entirely. At one point near midnight, a gust of such violence struck the tower that the whole structure groaned and shuddered, and Minnie, thrown off balance on the narrow spiral stairs, would have fallen if Emmett had not caught her against his chest, one strong arm wrapping around her waist and holding her steady as though she weighed nothing at all. "I have you," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear, and for a moment, suspended there in the howling dark with the tower swaying beneath them and his heartbeat strong and steady against her back, Minnie felt entirely, impossibly safe, in a way she had not felt since her father died. "Thank you," she managed, once she had found her footing again, though she found she was in no great hurry to step out of the circle of his arm. "Don't thank me," Emmett said, echoing his own words from that first stormy night, though this time his voice held a warmth that had not been there before. "Just don't go falling down my tower stairs, Miss Brooks. I've grown rather attached to having you keep this light." Toward 3 in the morning, through a brief tear in the driving rain, Minnie caught sight of the schooners running lights out beyond the rocks, and watched with her heart in her throat as the vessel fought her way past Solace Point, close enough that she fancied she could hear, beneath the shriek of the wind, the groan of the ship's timbers straining against the sea. And then, agonizingly slow, the lights began to draw away, out toward open water and safety, the captain having seen the beam of Cape Solace light burning steady through the storm, and used it to judge his distance from the deadly rocks below. "She's clear," Emmett said, standing close behind Minnie at the lantern room window, his breath warm against her hair. "She's going to make it." Minnie let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and felt tears prick hot and sudden at the corners of her eyes, tears of relief and exhaustion and a fierce, glowing pride unlike anything she had felt in all her 24 years. "We did that," she whispered. "We kept her off the rocks." "You did that," Emmett corrected gently, turning her by the shoulders to face him, his big hands warm and careful on her rain-damp arms. "I only carried oil cans, Minnie Brooks. You're the one who kept that lamp burning steady all night long, on your own 2 feet, doing your father's work same as if he stood here watching you do it. I expect he'd be prouder of you tonight than he ever had cause to be in his whole life." It was the first time he had called her by her given name, and something in the sound of it, low and rough and warm in his mouth, undid something in Minnie's chest that she had been holding tight and careful since the day her father died. She found herself leaning into him before she had quite decided to do it, resting her forehead against the solid warmth of his chest, and Emmett's arms came around her without hesitation, holding her steady while the storm raged on outside the glass, and the great lens turned its patient beam out over a sea now empty of any ship in danger. They did not kiss that night. It was not yet time, though both of them, standing wrapped together in the lamp room as the first gray light of dawn began to creep over the eastern hills, felt the pull of it, the inevitability of it, settling quiet and certain between them like the turning of the great lens itself, patient, steady, promising. Word of the schooner's narrow rescue spread quickly along the coast, as such stories do, and within a fortnight it had reached the ears of the district superintendent's office in San Francisco, prompting the Lighthouse board to dispatch an inspector to Cape Solace to assess the new keeper's fitness for her post, a formality Minnie had known was coming, but had hoped might wait until she had settled more fully into her duties. The inspector, a narrow, precise man named Aldous Prout, arrived by boat on a clear July morning, and made no secret of his skepticism from the moment he set foot on the landing. "Miss Brooks, I presume," he said, looking her up and down with the same doubtful expression the storekeeper in Port Amity had worn on her first day. I confess the board did not fully appreciate, when your application was approved, quite how young and how unaccompanied you truly were. This is a remote and demanding station. Old Tobias Reed himself, a man of 60 years and considerable experience, found its isolation trying toward the end. I have managed the post without incident for 2 months now, Mr. Prout, Minnie said, keeping her voice level though her hands had curled into fists at her sides. The log is kept faithfully, the lens is polished and in perfect working order, and just 3 weeks past this light guided the schooner Nautilus safely past Solace Rocks in the worst storm this coast has seen in a decade. I would be glad to show you the log entries, and the tower itself, so that you might judge my fitness by the evidence rather than by my age or my sex. Prout's thin eyebrows rose at her directness, but he followed her up the tower stairs all the same, and spent the better part of an hour examining the lens, the clockwork mechanism, the oil reservoir, and the meticulous logbook with its neat columns of weather and ship sightings. And Minnie watched with carefully hidden anxiety as his expression shifted, slowly, from skepticism toward something more like grudging respect. "This is fine work, Miss Brooks," he admitted finally, closing the logbook. "Finer, if I am honest, than Tobias Reed's own records in his last years, when his eyesight had begun to fail him." He paused, studying her with a more thoughtful expression. "There remains, however, the matter of the station's isolation, and the board's concern for a woman living entirely alone on so remote a point, with no family, no husband, no protection against the dangers such a posting might present." "I am not entirely alone," Minnie said, before she had quite decided to say it, and immediately felt her cheeks warm. As if summoned by her words, boots sounded on the tower stairs below, and Emmett appeared in the doorway a moment later, having climbed up from his morning's work repairing the cottage fence, his shirt damp with sweat, his powerful forearms streaked with dirt, looking every inch the mountain man that he was, and Prout's eyes went wide at the sight of him filling the doorway. "Mr. Warren," Prout said, recovering himself, "I take it you are some manner of neighbor to Miss Brooks." "I am," Emmett said, coming to stand beside Minnie with an easy, protective closeness that spoke louder than any explanation. "Cabin's up the ridge, half a mile off. I've kept watch over this station near 2 years, since before Tobias passed, and I'll keep watching over it, and its keeper, long as I'm able. Miss Brooks don't want for protection, Mr. Prout, nor for help when help's needed, same as any keeper along this coast might call on a neighbor in a storm." Prout looked between the two of them for a long moment, taking in, Minnie suspected, far more than either of them had intended to reveal, and something like understanding and perhaps even approval settled over his precise features. "Well," he said at last, "it appears Cape Solace Light is in more capable hands than the board had feared. I shall recommend Miss Brooks's appointment be confirmed as permanent, pending the usual review in 12 months' time." He tucked his notebook away and offered Minnie a small, formal bow. "Good day to you both. And Miss Brooks, I might add, this is the best-kept station I have inspected on this entire stretch of coast, sex of the keeper notwithstanding." When Prout had gone, rowed back out to his waiting boat by a hired hand, Minnie turned to Emmett with a laugh half of relief and half of triumph bubbling up in her chest. "You did not have to come to my defense, Mr. Warren, but I confess I am glad you did." "Couldn't let the man walk off thinking you had nobody watching your back," Emmett said, and the look he gave her then was warm enough to chase away the last of the morning's chill. "Reckon I've grown fond of watching it, these past 2 months. But not every visitor to Cape Solace that summer came with the Lighthouse Board's authority or good intentions, and the peace Minnie had begun to build for herself was soon to be tested by a danger far more deliberate than any storm. It began, though neither Minnie nor Emmett understood it as such at the time, with small signs of trouble along the cove below the point, a place the locals called Widow's Landing for reasons no one quite remembered anymore. Minnie noticed it first on her evening walks along the cliff path, small things that struck her as odd. a flattened patch of grass near the trail down to the beach, as though something heavy had been dragged across it in the dark. The lingering smell of tar and spirits on the sea wind some mornings, out of place against the ordinary salt and kelp. Once, the glint of a lantern far below on the rocks near midnight, quickly extinguished when she leaned out to look closer. She mentioned it to Emmett one evening as they sat together on the cottage porch, watching the sun sink orange and heavy into the water, a habit that had become, without either of them quite naming it as courtship, the sweetest part of Minnie's day. "Smugglers," Emmett said grimly, when she described what she had seen. "Ought to have thought of it sooner. There's a fellow named Silas Crane runs contraband whiskey and Chinese silk up this coast from Mexico. Has done for years, and Widow's Landing has always been a favorite spot of his on account of how the rocks shelter a small boat from the worst of the surf. With this light dark for months before you came, and Tobias too old and too ill in his last year to keep proper watch, Crane's had free run of that cove after dark, landing his goods and moving them inland before dawn without a soul the wiser. And now the light is burning steady every night," Minnie said slowly, understanding dawning, "which means anyone watching from a ship offshore or from town would know the station is manned again and might grow curious about activity along the cove that a proper keeper would surely notice and report. Which makes you an inconvenience to a man like Silas Crane," Emmett said, his jaw tightening, "and I don't like the thought of that one bit." He began, after that conversation, to make a habit of walking the cliff path himself in the evenings before climbing to his cabin, and more than once Minnie caught sight of him standing sentinel on the point long after dark had fallen, a solitary, broad-shouldered shape against the stars, watching the cove below with the patient stillness of a man who had spent years learning to read the wilderness for danger. She found his vigilance both comforting and, in some small corner of her heart, deeply moving. This man who had already given so much of his time and his solitude to a light that was not even his to keep, now giving his nights as well to keep her safe from a threat she had not even known to fear. The trouble came to a head on a moonless night in early August, when Minnie woke past midnight to the sound of raised voices carrying up from the cove on the wind, and rising to her window saw lantern light moving among the rocks below, more lanterns than any innocent fishing party would need. She dressed quickly and hurried out onto the cliff path, driven by a keeper's instinct that something was deeply wrong, and found Emmett already there, having heard the same commotion from his cabin higher up the ridge, his rifle in hand. "Get back inside, Minnie," he said, low and urgent, using her given name in the sharp way he only did when something had frightened him badly. "This isn't a sight for you to be caught watching." "I am the keeper of this station," Minnie said, refusing to budge, "and whatever is happening on that beach is happening beneath my light. I have as much right to know as you." Below them, in the flickering lantern light, they could make out perhaps 6 men working quickly to unload crates from a small boat drawn up on the sand, and a 7th man standing apart, directing the work with sharp gestures, his voice carrying up thin and angry on the wind. "That's Crane," Emmett murmured, "the one giving orders." As if the words themselves had carried down to him, the man below suddenly went still, then turned his face up toward the cliff, and even at that distance and in that poor light, Minnie felt a chill go through her at the pale flash of his face turned toward them. "Someone's watching," Crane's voice rang out sharp across the water. "Up on the point. Go see who it is." "Now we run," Emmett said, seizing Minnie's hand, and they scrambled back along the cliff path together in the darkness, Emmett's grip firm and sure even as loose stones skittered away beneath their hurried feet, until they had gained the shelter of the lighthouse tower itself, its door heavy and solid, and Emmett threw the bolt behind them with a grim finality. "They won't dare come up to the light itself," he said, breathing hard, checking his rifle in the dim glow of the single lamp Minnie kept burning in the tower's base. "Too public, too many eyes on a federal station even out here, but Crane won't forget this." He'll know now that his cove is being watched, and men like him don't take kindly to being watched. Minnie's heart was still hammering from the run, but beneath the fear she felt something else stirring, a hot, clean anger at the thought of criminals using the dark beneath her light to smuggle their contraband, endangering, perhaps, the very ship she had sworn to protect. "Then we will simply have to watch him more closely still," she said. "I will note every unusual light, every strange sound in my station log, and I will send word to the customs authorities in Port Amity at the first opportunity. This is my post, Mr. Warren, and I will not be frightened off it by a smuggler's temper." Emmett looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight, something fierce and proud and worried all warring together in his dark eyes. And then, before either of them had quite decided the moment had come, he closed the distance between them and kissed her. It was not a gentle, tentative thing, that first kiss, but something born of fear and relief and weeks of held-back longing, his big hands coming up to cradle her face with a tenderness that belied their strength. And Minnie rose up on her toes to meet him, her own hands fisting in the front of his shirt. And for a long, breathless moment the danger on the beach below and the whole wide world beyond the tower door simply ceased to exist. When at last they broke apart, both a little unsteady, Emmett rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm and ragged against her lips. "I have been wanting to do that since the night of the storm," he admitted, low and rough, "when I caught you on the stairs and thought my heart would beat clean out of my chest, not from the danger of the wind, but from having you that close and not being able to hold on to you the way I wanted." "You might have simply told me," Minnie said, laughing softly despite the fear still coursing through her, "rather than waiting for smugglers to nearly discover us on a cliff at midnight." "Didn't seem the sort of thing a man rushes," Emmett said, "not after what I lost before. Took me a long while to trust I'd want to feel this way again about anybody." He drew back just enough to look at her properly, his thumb tracing gentle along her cheekbone. "But I do, Minnie Brooks. I want it plain and simple. I love you. Have done, I think, since that first stormy night you near brained me with a fire poker, and then fed me venison stew like I hadn't half frightened you out of your wits." "I love you too, Emmett Warren," Minnie said, and found the words came easier than she had expected, true and certain as the beam of the great lens turning steady above them. "Though I would ask that we finish falling in love somewhere Selah's crane is not likely to interrupt us with a knife or a pistol." "Fair enough," Emmett said, and pressed one more soft kiss to her forehead before turning back to the practical business of standing watch through the remainder of that tense and sleepless night, though now his arm stayed wrapped protectively around her shoulders as they waited together for dawn. The days that followed were tense ones, Minnie sending a careful letter to the customs house in Port Amity, describing the suspicious activity at Widow's Landing without naming names she could not yet prove, while Emmett kept his nightly vigils along the cliff path and taught Minnie, over her mild protests that a keeper ought not need such skills, how to load and fire the old rifle he kept at his cabin, in case Crane's men grew bolder. For nearly 3 weeks, nothing happened, and Minnie allowed herself to hope the smugglers had simply moved their operations to some other, less watched stretch of coast. She and Emmett settled into a courtship as steady and warm as the lamp she tended each evening, sharing suppers, working the garden together, sitting long hours on the porch while he told her stories of the mountain and she told him stories of her father, and twice more he kissed her, unhurried now, sweet and certain, in the golden hour before sunset when the whole cape seemed to hold its breath in beauty. But Selah's crane had not forgotten the watchers on the cliff, and he was not a man inclined to let an inconvenience simply resolve itself. The blow came in early September, on a night when a storm nearly as violent as that first great tempest was building out over the water, and Minnie climbed the tower at dusk to light the lamp only to discover, with a cold lurch of dread, that the oil reservoir, which she had filled that very morning, now stood nearly empty, and worse, the clockwork mechanism that turned the great lens sat frozen and silent, jammed with something gritty and foreign that had never been in its gears before. "Sand," she breathed, running her fingers through the fine grit that had been packed deliberately into the delicate mechanism. "Someone has done this on purpose." She lit the lamp by hand regardless, knowing a fixed beam was better than none at all, though it would not carry nor warn ships nearly so well as the turning light, and hurried down to send for Emmett, only to find, when she reached the cottage door, a folded note pinned there with a knife that had certainly not been left by any friendly hand. "Keep watching my business," the note read in a crude scrawl, "and next time it won't be your lamp that gets broke." Minnie's hands shook as she read it, not from fear for herself alone, but from a fierce, protective fury at the thought that this man would threaten the light itself, the very thing that kept sailors from drowning on the rocks below. She tore the note from the door and ran for the cliff path, the storm building fast overhead, thunder beginning to rumble far out over the water, and found Emmett already climbing down from his cabin, having seen the lamp steady rather than turning light and known at once something was wrong. "He sabotaged the mechanism," Minnie said, breathless, thrusting the note into his hands. "Sand in the gears, oil nearly drained. The lamp is lit, but it won't turn, Emmett, and there's a storm coming that will need every advantage that light can give a ship trying to find safe water." Emmett read the note once, his face going hard and cold in a way Minnie had not seen before, all the easy warmth of the past weeks replaced by something granite, still and dangerous. "Crane's grown careless in his anger," he said. "That's a mistake on his part. Threatening a federal lighthouse keeper is a hanging offense in a court that takes it seriously, and I mean to see he faces exactly that." He handed the note back to her. "But first we've got a lamp to fix and a storm bearing down, and that comes before any reckoning with Crane. Show me the mechanism." They worked together through the gathering storm, Emmett's strong hands patient and careful as he disassembled the jammed clockwork gear by gear, blowing the fine sand free, cleaning each brass tooth with a soft cloth soaked in oil while Minnie held the lantern steady and fretted over the rising wind outside. Until at last, with perhaps 20 minutes to spare before the storm's full fury struck, the mechanism caught and turned, and the great lens began once more its slow, patient rotation, throwing its beam far out across a sea already churning white with the first of the storm's fury. "It's turning," Minnie breathed, relief flooding through her so completely her knees nearly buckled. "Emmett, you did it." "We did it," he corrected, echoing her own words back to her from that first great storm, and drew her against his chest in a fierce embrace that spoke of fear only now allowed to surface, now that the crisis had passed. "I should have seen this coming. Should have warned Crane off properly weeks ago instead of just watching from the cliff like a fool." "You could not have known he would stoop to sabotaging a lighthouse," Minnie said, though her voice trembled with the same fear he clearly felt. "But Emmett, if he is bold enough to threaten the lamp itself, what is to stop him coming after one of us next?" The answer to that question arrived far sooner than either of them wished, and in a manner more dangerous than either had feared. 3 nights later, with the sabotaged mechanism repaired but Minnie's nerves still raw from the threat, another storm rolled in off the Pacific, this one accompanied by a fog so thick it seemed to swallow the beam of the lamp itself within a few hundred yards of the tower, rendering the light nearly useless for any vessel further out. Minnie kept anxious watch through the evening, straining to hear any sound above the wind and the crash of surf, and it was Emmett, arriving later than usual from his cabin, his face grim in the lamplight, who brought the news that would draw the night's true danger to its head. "There's a supply boat overdue," he said, shaking rain from his coat as he climbed into the lamp room. "Fellow in town told me before this storm blew in. A schooner out of San Francisco carrying goods for Port Amity, including your quarterly oil resupply, was due 2 days back and hasn't been sighted. Given this fog, if she's still out there trying to make port, she'll be running near blind." "Then we must do everything possible to be seen," Minnie said, already moving to check the lamp's flame, though the fog pressing thick against the windows made the effort feel almost futile. It was near midnight when they heard it, faint at first beneath the wind, then unmistakable. The distant, desperate blast of a ship's horn, sounding again and again in a pattern of distress, somewhere out beyond the fog bank, dangerously close to Solace Rocks. "She's lost in the fog," Emmett said, already moving toward the stairs. "Light alone won't reach her through this murk. I've got to get down to the point with a signal fire, give her something closer to steer by." "I'm coming with you," Minnie said at once. "Minnie, it's black as pitch out there and the rocks are treacherous even in daylight, and you cannot build and tend a signal fire alone while also watching for a ship in distress," Minnie said firmly. "I am coming, Emmett Warren, and that is the end of the discussion." They fought their way down the cliff path together through wind and rain, carrying oil-soaked torches and a bundle of dry kindling Emmett had thought to keep stored against just such an emergency. And on the rocky point closest to the deadly Solace Rocks, they built a signal fire that blazed defiant against the fog and dark, feeding it with driftwood and pitch pine that Emmett produced from some hidden cache, while overhead the tower's beam continued its patient sweep. And together the two lights, one ancient and mechanical, one primal and hand-fed, threw enough combined glow into the fog that the ship's horn, when it sounded again, seemed closer and steadier, as though her captain had found something to steer by at last. For nearly an hour they fed that fire, soaked to the skin, Minnie's arms aching from hauling driftwood, Emmett working beside her with the tireless strength that had first struck her as almost frightening on that stormy first night, and now filled her only with a fierce and grateful love, until at last the fog began to thin with the changing tide, and through the gray murk they made out the schooner's shape, close, far too close to the rocks, but turning, correcting her course. Her captain having found his bearings at last from the twin beacons on the point. "She's clearing the rocks," Emmett said, his voice hoarse with smoke and shouting and relief. "Minnie, look, she's clearing them." They watched together, arms wrapped around each other against the cold and the wet, as the schooner fought her way past the deadly rocks and into calmer water beyond, her horn sounding once more, a long, grateful blast that Minnie chose to believe was a thank you carried back to them on the wind. It was in the midst of that relief, both of them exhausted and soaked and triumphant, that the true danger of the night revealed itself. For out of the darkness along the point came three men, lanterns shuddered until the last moment, and at their head, his face twisted with fury in the dying light of the signal fire, Silas Crane himself. "You just cost me a night's landing," Crane snarled, his voice carrying ugly over the wind. "That fog was going to cover my boat's approach clean past your light, and now you've gone and lit half the point up like the 4th of July. He had a pistol in his hand, Minnie saw with a cold jolt of fear, held loose but ready at his side. "I warned you, lady. Told you plain what would happen if you kept meddling in my business. Your business is smuggling contraband past a federal light station," Minnie said, drawing herself up despite her fear, some fierce, stubborn strength rising in her that would not let her cower before this man, not with Emmett's solid presence beside her, and the memory of the schooner safely past the rocks still warm in her chest. "I have already sent word to the customs authorities describing the activity at Widow's Landing, Mr. Crane. Whatever you do to me tonight will only hasten your own arrest." Crane's face darkened further at that, and he took a step forward, raising the pistol slightly. But Emmett moved faster than Minnie would have believed possible for a man his size, placing himself bodily between her and the weapon, his own considerable bulk a wall of muscle and fury that made even Crane's men hesitate. "You'll have to go through me first, Crane," Emmett said, his voice a low, dangerous growl unlike anything Minnie had heard from him before, "and I promise you that will not go the way you're hoping." For a long, tense moment the standoff held, the fire crackling between them, the surf crashing against the rocks below, and then from further down the cliff path came the sound of more voices, more lanterns bobbing in the darkness, and a shout that carried clear over the wind. "Customs officers, stand where you are." Crane's face went from fury to panic in an instant, and he and his 2 men bolted for the cove below. But they had not counted on the schooner's own crew, alerted by the signal fire and now anchored safely just offshore, having already sent word ashore of suspicious activity witnessed near the point, word that had reached a customs patrol already investigating Minnie's earlier letter, and positioned, by fortunate timing, close enough to respond that very night. Crane and his men made it perhaps 30 yards before they were run down on the rocky beach and taken into custody, and by the gray light of dawn, as the storm finally broke and cleared, Minnie and Emmett stood together on the cliff and watched the customs officers march their prisoners away toward Port Amity, the threat that had hung over the station for weeks finally, fully lifted. "It's over," Minnie said, leaning gratefully into Emmett's side, exhaustion finally catching up with her now that the danger had passed. "Truly over." "It is," Emmett agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her damp hair. "And Minnie Brooks, I do not intend to let another storm or another scoundrel pass through this station without you standing exactly where you're standing now, safe in my arms, for the rest of my days, if you'll have me." Minnie went very still, understanding the shape of what he was asking even before he had fully asked it, and tilted her face up to look at him properly, her heart suddenly beating for reasons that had nothing to do with fear or exhaustion. "Emmett Warren, are you asking me to marry you on a cliff at dawn, soaked to the skin and reeking of smoke?" "Reckon I am," Emmett said, and there was something almost boyish in the sudden uncertainty that crossed his weathered face, so at odds with the fierce protector who had faced down an armed smuggler not an hour before. "No, it's not the sort of proposal a woman dreams of, with fine clothes and flowers and all that. But I've loved you since near the first week I knew you, Minnie, loved your stubbornness and your courage, and the way you took to this light like it was made just for you. I don't want to spend one more night going back up that mountain to my empty cabin when I could be here instead, keeping this light with you, keeping you, for as long as we both draw breath." Minnie felt tears rise, hot and sudden, mixing with the rain still clinging to her lashes, and she did not hesitate even a moment before answering. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Emmett Warren, I will marry you. Storm-soaked proposal and all, I would not trade this moment for the finest flowers and clothes in San Francisco." He kissed her then, there on the cliff with the dawn breaking gold and pink over a sea gone calm and blue after the night's violence. And Minnie thought, in the small clear part of her mind still capable of thought, that her father would have loved this man, would have recognized in him the same steady devotion to duty and to the safety of strangers that had defined his own life, and that somewhere, wherever he was surely glad his daughter had found this particular kind of happiness at the edge of the world. They were married 6 weeks later, in the small church at Port Amity, with the storekeeper and half the town in attendance, having heard the full story of the smugglers' capture, and the schooner's rescue and grown considerably warmer toward the lady keeper of Cape Solace Light in the telling. Minnie wore a dress of pale blue that she had sewn herself in the evenings after her lighthouse duties were done, and Emmett, scrubbed and shaved and dressed in a coat that strained gloriously across his broad shoulders, looked so uncharacteristically nervous standing at the altar that Minnie could not help laughing softly when she saw him, which seemed to ease something in him, for he grinned back at her, wide and unguarded, in a way that made the whole church seem to brighten. Inspector Aldous Prout, who had returned for the occasion at Minnie's invitation, offered a formal but genuinely warm toast at the small gathering afterward, noting for the assembled guests that in all his years with the Lighthouse Board, he had never inspected a station kept with such devotion, nor witnessed a keeper better protected or better loved, and that the board, upon hearing the full account of the smugglers' capture, had voted to award Minnie a formal commendation for her service, along with funds for a proper new keeper's assistant position, which, Prout noted with a small smile, seemed likely to be filled by her new husband in all but official title. Emmett moved into the keeper's cottage after the wedding, though he kept his mountain cabin as well, using it still for hunting trips and for the quiet solitude he sometimes needed, a habit Minnie never once tried to break him of, understanding that a man who had known such loss needed always to keep one foot in the wilderness that had healed him. But his heart, and the greater portion of his days, belonged now to the Cape, to the lighthouse, and to the woman who tended it. Their life together settled into a rhythm that Minnie found more deeply content than any she could have imagined back in her mother's parlor in the East. Emmett officially took up work as her assistant keeper the following spring, a position the board approved without hesitation given his years of unofficial service. And together, they kept Cape Solace light burning through every storm that rolled in off the Pacific for years to come, never once letting the flame gutter, never once letting a ship run blind onto Solace rocks. Their first child, a son they named Jonas after Minnie's father, was born in the spring of 1880, a strong, loud, healthy boy who from his earliest years seemed fascinated by the great turning lens, and who by the age of 6 could recite the station log's proper format better than some grown keepers Minnie had heard of along the coast. 2 years later came a daughter, Grace, named for the little girl Emmett had lost so many years before, a gift Minnie offered her husband not out of pity, but out of a genuine wish to honor a love that had shaped him into the man she had come to cherish. And Emmett wept openly the first time he held his new daughter, whispering to her a promise that she would grow up loved and safe and watched over always, by a light that never went dark. They raised their children on that windswept point, teaching them to trim wicks and polish brass and read the moods of the sea, teaching them too the story of the mother who had claimed an abandoned post no one else wanted, and the mountain man who had kept her lamp burning through every storm before he ever dared hope she might keep his heart burning too. Silas Crane and his men were tried and convicted in San Francisco the following year, sentenced to long terms for smuggling and for the threats made against a federal officer, and Widow's Landing became, in time, simply a quiet cove where local children gathered driftwood, its darker history fading slowly into the kind of story old men tell young ones on winter evenings. Minnie kept her post at Cape Solace Light for 31 years, through storms and calms, through the slow changing of the coast around her as Port Amity grew from a rough timber town into a proper small city, through the births of 2 more children after Jonas and Grace, a second son named Tobias in honor of the old keeper, whose lamp she had first found still faithfully tended, and a youngest daughter named Sarah, for the wife Emmett had loved and lost before he ever thought to love again. And every single night of those 31 years, whether the sky was clear and full of stars or black, and screaming with the worst the Pacific could throw at that lonely point of rock, the great lens of Cape Solace Light turned its steady, patient beam out over the water, kept burning first by a woman who refused to let her father's calling die with him, and then, every storm after, by the 2 of them together, side by side. Exactly as they had promised each other on a rain-soaked cliff at dawn, so very long ago. When Emmett Warren finally passed, peacefully, in his own bed at the age of 78 with Minnie's hand in his, and their grown children and grandchildren gathered close around, his last words, murmured with the ghost of that same crooked smile she had first seen in a lamp room on a stormy night, were that he had climbed a great many mountains and weathered a great many storms in his long life, but that the finest thing he had ever done was climb the stairs of a lighthouse tower one wild night and find, waiting at the top of them, a woman with a poker in her hand and a whole steady lifetime of love burning bright behind her eyes. Minnie kept the light 1 more year after that, with her son Jonas at her side as her official assistant, before passing the keeper's post formally into his capable hands, content at last to sit on the cottage porch in the golden evenings and watch the beam she and Emmett had tended together for so many years continue its faithful, unbroken turning, a light that had once been abandoned and nearly lost, now burning on, generation after generation, exactly as steady and as certain as the love that had first relit it.